Welcome back to Project 613. Today we will learn 7 mitzvot. The first of which is the Torah's prohibition on intermarriage. The Torah tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 7, V'lo titchaten bam, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons. Do not take their daughters for your sons. It's from this passage as well that we learn that Jewish identity follows the mother. If the mother is Jewish, then the child born will be Jewish. If the mother isn't Jewish, then even if the father is, then the child born would not be considered Jewish. The second mitzvah that we learn today concerns the descendants of the nations of Ammon and Moab, where the Torah tells us we are forbidden from allowing their descendants from ever marrying into the Jewish people. This is because of the way these two nations mistreated the Jewish people. When the Jewish people were traveling in the desert, these two nations refused the basic necessities of bread and water to the Jewish people, even after they were offered money to pay for it. And therefore the Torah decrees that their descendants are never allowed to marry into the Jewish people, even if they would convert. The third and fourth mitzvah that we learn today concerns the descendants of the nations of Edom and the descendants of the Egyptians, where the Torah tells us an interesting law, that for the first 2 generations, these two nations as well may not marry into the Jewish people, but from the 3rd generation and on, the descendants of Edom and the descendants of the Egyptians may marry into the Jewish people so long as they convert. And the specific prohibition that we learn is that we are forbidden from rejecting them. It is forbidden for us to reject a 3rd generation Edomite convert or a 3rd generation Egyptian convert. And doing so would be a violation of this mitzvah. Now, what's the reason for this? The Torah itself tells us when it comes to the Edomites, the Torah tells us, Ki achichahu. They are your brothers. The Edomites are the cousins of the Jewish people. Edom is a descendant of Esau, who was a brother of Jacob. And when it comes to the Egyptians, even though the Jewish people suffered tremendously at the hands of the Egyptians, nevertheless, the Jewish people also were saved by the Egyptians when the Egyptians hosted the Jewish people, when Jacob and his family traveled to Egypt at the time of the famine. And therefore, the Torah allows the 3rd generation Egyptian to marry into the Jewish people. Now, practically speaking, when it comes to these 4 mitzvot that we learn about the descendants of Ammon and Moab and Edom and the descendants of the Egyptians, practically speaking, these mitzvot are not applicable today, simply because we do not know who are the descendants of the nations that the Bible talks about. Because of all of the intermingling and moving around of nations, the current Egyptians are certainly not descendants of the Egyptians of that time, and so too with the other nations. And therefore the halacha is that any convert from any nation who converts halachically is allowed to marry into the Jewish people. The 5th mitzvah that we learn today concerns a mamzer. A mamzer, the halachic mamzer, is a child born of certain illicit relationships, specifically a child born of an adulterous relationship or a child born of one of the incestual relationships that we learned about previously. And the Torah prohibits such an individual, as sad as it is. This is a very sad situation, but the Torah prohibits such an individual from marrying most Jewish women, and the mamzer is very much limited by who he will be able to marry. The 6th mitzvah that we learned today concerns an individual whose reproductive organs have become cut off or damaged so severely that he can no longer father children, and such an individual as well is very much limited, and there's a prohibition on such an individual from marrying most Jewish women. His choice is also very much limited. Now, when it comes to this prohibition, this is specifically only if this was caused by man. But if this condition, let's say if this individual was born with this condition, or he was bit by a dog, or he had to have these organs removed due to a life-saving surgery, then this prohibition would not apply, and he would be allowed to marry any other Jewish woman. The final mitzvah that we learned today is the prohibition of castration. It's forbidden to castrate either a man or an animal. To cause either a man or an animal to not be able to reproduce is a biblical violation, and that is the final prohibition that we learned today. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.